In this week's parsha, we have the story about the Milchemes Midyan, the war that the Yidden have against Midyan, the spoils that they take from this war. And in continuation to this, in connection to this, Elazar speaks to the Yidden when they come back with the spoils of war and tells them the laws of kashering the kalim. He also tells them, according to Rashi, in one of the Pirushim, he also tells them about the concept of toiveling, kalim that belong to a goy. Now, the Ramban asks, why is it that the Yidden weren't commanded about these halachos earlier on in the wars against Sichain and Oig? Why weren't they told over there about kashering kalim? What the Ramban answers is that there's a major difference between the lands of Sichain and Oig and Midyan. Sichain and Oig is from the lands that the Yidden were going to conquer, they were going to inherit, they were going to keep. And the halacha was that they were allowed to take all of the spoils. In fact, even forbidden food, they were allowed to have. And therefore, if they're even allowed to have the forbidden food of the spoils, clearly they're allowed to have the vessels that absorbed non-kosher food. And therefore, there's no question why they weren't commanded to kasher those kalim. Whereas Milchemes Midyan, which was more about just fighting and taking revenge against the Midyanim, this was not going to be a place where Yidden were going to inherit and keep. This was not an area where they were just able to have Isurim, take benefit of the things of Isur, and therefore the kalim that they did end up taking, the vessels that they did end up getting, they would need to kasher, they would need to get rid of any Isur, any forbidden food that was absorbed in those kalim. So the question is asked, why is it that Tvilas Kalim, which as mentioned before is also mentioned in our Parsha, why was this mitzvah not told to the Yidden by the Milchama of Sichain and Oig? Now here, seemingly, we would not be able to answer, which we just answered, that in that Milchama they were even able to have things that were clearly Asur, because Tvilas Kalim is, according to the point of where we're up to in the Sikha now, later we're going to see something else, but Tvilas Kalim is nothing to do with the Isur that it absorbed, because the halacha is that even a new Keli from a Goy also needs to have Tvila, but rather, as the Yerushalmi says, because they're leaving the tumah of being by a Goy, and coming now to the Kedusha of a Yid, this is why a Keli of a Goy needs to have Tevilah. And therefore, we can no longer say that the Kelim of Sichain and Oig didn't need Tevilah. Yes, the Isur aspect, the non-kosher aspect, possibly wasn't an issue, but it's still now entering the Kedusha of a Yid. Seemingly, it would need to be toiveled. So why doesn't the Ramban ask the same question regarding Tvilas Kelim? Of why Tvilas Kelim wasn't mentioned earlier? Now, the Rebbe says, seemingly you would be able to answer based on the concept that not all mitzvahs were given immediately at Matan Torah. There were some mitzvahs that were given later. And therefore, perhaps you could say, there's no question why the Yidden weren't commanded for Tvilas Kelim by that earlier war. It just was not time for that mitzvah to be given yet. So why does the Ramban ask the question regarding the kashering of Kelim? Because we have proof from earlier in the Torah that this concept did exist earlier, kashering kalim, as opposed to toiveling kalim. How is that? Because in Parshas Tzav, when it's dealing with a korban chatos, now we know a korban chatos has a certain amount of time, how long it can be eaten, and after that the remaining meat is called noisor. So the halacha is, the Torah tells us that you need to kasher those kalim in an earthenware vessel. You need to break it. Other types of kalim, you need to kasher it in other ways. But the point is that this concept of that a keli could absorb the isur that's inside of it did exist earlier already. This is why the Ramban perhaps is asking regarding kashering kalim, if the din of kashering kalim exists already, why weren't the Yidden warned about this when they are in the Milchama of Sichain and Oig? Again, as opposed to Tvilas Kalim, which you could just say simply, it wasn't time for this halacha to be told yet. But the Rebbe says this isn't a completely smooth answer, because the question still remains, why doesn't the Ramban himself point out this difference between Tvilas Kalim and kashering the Kalim? Why doesn't he deal with this issue at all? Says the Rebbe, we're going to understand this by first looking at another two questions related to the din of Tvilas Kalim. In the Nusach Shtar Mechiras Chometz of the Alter Rebbe, he writes that we sell the kelim that have clearly visible, noticeable chometz on them. Those kelim we are also selling to the goy. Now here's the question. What about toiveling the kelim after they were sold to the goy, when we get them back after Pesach? The Alter Rebbe doesn't tell us anything at all that we need to toivel these kelim. We don't see that people toivel the kelim after Pesach. Why not? Another question regarding Shavuos. One of the reasons we eat milchiks on Shavuos is commemorating the milchiks that they ate on the day of Matan Torah. Why were they eating milchiks as opposed to fleishiks? Because by Matan Torah they were just given the dinim of shchita. Before Matan Torah, the meat they ate, even if technically they would have shechted it, they didn't have the status of bari zvicha. They couldn't shecht in the way a yid shecht. They didn't have that category of being able to be a sheichet. So therefore, even if had they shechted something, it wouldn't have been shechted meat. So all of their fleishik kelim would have become osur. So on the day of Matan Torah, they can't shecht, they can't kasher their kelim because it's Shabbos, and therefore the only choice remaining is to eat milchiks. Now seemingly you could come and ask, hang on a second, why don't they need a kasher their milchik kelim? What about any meat that would have been absorbed in those kelim if they wouldn't have been careful before Matan Torah with cooking meat in milchik kelim? So why aren't they kashering the milchik kelim? How could they use the milchik kelim? And the answer would be that the Yidden, already from the time they're leaving Mitzrayim, knowing that they're getting the Torah, they would have been careful in all of the dinim of milk and meat. They would have had separate vessels for milchiks. So there was no mixture of milk and meat. The milchik kelim, there's no problem with them. Again, as far as meat, is a different issue, because even if they would have tried to do the halachos of keeping kosher, their shchita wasn't a shchita before, so they have to kasher the kelim. But back to the milchik kelim, the question still remains. Even if they don't have to kasher the kelim from any meat that was inside of it, but if, based on what we said before, that the kelim are now entering to the kedusha of Yisrael, why don't they need to toivel the kelim? How could they be using the milchik kelim after Matan Torah without toiveling them? Says the Rebbe, we're going to understand this looking at Rashi when he deals in our parsha with this idea of toiveling kelim. And this is what Rashi says. The vessels, first of all, needed to be kashered from purifying them from the Isur. They also needed to be purified from any sort of tumah if they came in contact with a dead body, because we're speaking over here about the kelim that were taken in the spoils of war. So that's Rashi's first comment. And then Rashi says, V'Rabbi Seinu Darshu, that sha'af la'achshiron mina isur to unin tvila, that also to make them kosher from the isur, they also need tvila. They need to be toiveled. So again, in Rashi's first explanation, he's discussing the kashering of the kelim from isur, from non-kosher food, or if they came in contact with a dead body. And then Rashi says, no, there's also a concept of toiveling them from isur. In other words, what's Rashi saying over here? That the tvila, toiveling kelim, is also related to isur. Not like we said earlier in the Sikha from the Yerushalmi, that is because it's coming from the tumah of a goy to the kedusha of a yid, but rather because we're toiveling it from isur. The question is, what does that mean? Why are we toiveling it from isur? What about if it's a new keli? Says the Rebbe, we're going to understand this by looking carefully at Rashi's words. Rashi says, lachshirum mina isur. It doesn't say letaharum as he used regarding kashering it. What does lachshirum mean? Lachshirum means to make it fit, usable, to be able to go ahead and use it now. In other words, it's not coming to remove the isur. That was dealt with already through kashering it. Or it's brand new. There was no isur in it. What we're saying now is we want to make it now ready, fit for a yid to use. The kind of use where there won't even be a possibility of isur. In other words, one was by the goy, it still had the potential for isur, even if he didn't actually use it. There's the potential for isur. Now that it's going over to the reshus of the yid, to a use where there won't even be a possibility for isur, the keli is going to be toiveled now, lachshirun, to make it fit, being removed from the possibility, the capability, the potential of isur to be properly by a yid now. So again, according to Rashi, it's not about the kedusha that it's entering, but rather it's to do with the isur, but not from a practical isur that's there, but even from the potential of the isur. Says the Rebbe, now we can understand all the things we mentioned earlier. Why doesn't the Ramban ask why Yidden aren't commanded about Tvilas Kelim by Melchemes Sichon and Oig? We said already that the Ramban holds that by Melchemes Sichon and Oig they were even allowed to have pure Isur. Now the Ramban is actually discussing Rashi, and Rashi we just said that the Tvila is also because of the potential of Isur. If by Melchemes Sichon and Oig they're even allowed to have Isur and the Kelim of Isur, there's nothing to discuss about toiveling them from the potential of Isur. They're having Isur itself. That's why the Ramban doesn't ask why they weren't told to toivel the Kelim of Sichon and Oig. What about the fact that we don't toivel the chametzdike vessels after Pesach? Says the Rebbe, these chametzdike vessels, it's not common at all that the goy is going to go ahead and use those kelim. In fact, if he would go and use them, we would even have to kasher those kelim. So therefore, we're not going to say about these kelim that they had the potential to become asur, to have isur in it, because again, the goy is b'chlal not going to be using it in any way for isur. Therefore, they don't need to be toiveled. In the same way, says the Rebbe, we also don't need to. The Yidden didn't need to toivel the milchike kelim by Matan Torah, right after Matan Torah, because as I said before, the Yidden were careful between milk and meat, even before Matan Torah. So, therefore, these kelim, so to speak, didn't even have the potential earlier of becoming asur, and therefore they also don't need to have the inyan of tevilah.